Welcome to the 99th episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to review our dominant road win in the Myrtle Beach Bowl game against Coastal Carolina. Let's get started. Before we get into the bowl game itself, let's talk a little bit about the trip, because we were lucky enough to be able to attend this game in person. We got to spend a little bit of time in Myrtle Beach, but then we also spent some time before and after the game in Charleston.
Yeah, Charleston was fun. It was described to us as a foodie paradise, but I think for us it was just the little shops. That's the very kind of southern charm that was down there, and then that drive up to the Dirty Murty. I mean, it was just, it could get excruciating at times. We kind of took I guess a shortcut, so to speak, because of Waze. But the problem really was that the speed limit really only got up to like 60, maybe.
Yeah,
At the fastest, and that was the grand problem. That's why I'm saying it was excruciating, because I mean, you're going through all these little towns, and it's not like you really get to a point where you really hit some open road. It was just like you're in a neighborhood and you're just kind of going around. So
yeah, rather than being in Texas where you hit the highway and you kind of fly down the road at 75 miles an hour, it was more like you were driving up 281, from San Antonio to the Austin area, and like hitting, kind of those little small towns, except it was like that the entire way. There was no, break in between where it was just open road. So it was a little different, but definitely very, very scenic. And
it was.
There was definitely a contrast between the commercialization of Myrtle Beach and sort of that old world feel of Charleston.
Yeah, and then you got to the country, I guess you could say, and it was, I don't know, I think I counted quite a bit of Dollar Generals on the way
right
between Charleston and Myrtle Beach. But, even the drive over to Conway it felt very much like you're going down like Bandera Road, the old school Bandera Road from like, from 410 to like 1604. And I'm talking about like, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when it really wasn't as much of a highway, I guess, or you could say, or like, and I forget what they really call it now, but it was just kind of light after light after light. And I was wondering why it was going to take like 20 minutes to get to Conway, right? And
yeah,
because it wasn't very far away. Yeah. But beautiful campus. I mean, I really liked the Coastal Carolina area that, it looks like they have a pretty cool, I think, parking lots separated out and just open areas to go and tailgate. And we saw plenty of Coastal fans when we drove in. I think we take it for granted when we're, at the Alamo Dome that, you've got the two big parking lots and everybody just tailgates in these two big gigantic parking lots. And when that's not the case, in just about every other place in the U.S. and a college. So fun area. Got to the stadium, and it was, I got to say, I did like the softball and baseball stadium being pretty close to the football stadium. The football stadium was about as small as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it sort of felt more like a soccer stadium than it did a football stadium. Like,
yeah,
it definitely felt like the Cure Bowl, that kind of same setup, and like the Frisco Bowl kind of setup.
Yeah, very intimate. And I think that was a cool part to it. But I did notice right away, I was like, because I looked at you and I said, hey, there's no suites. There's nothing.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting. They had this club area, and again, it was an odd setup because the club area was on the visitor side, but that was where all of the Coastal, fans and the UTSA fans were together. So it was sort of an interesting kind of setup that you would have this club area on the visitor side, just in general, like it wouldn't have been on your home side.
And you say all of these like UTSA fans, but there really wasn't that many.
Well, sure.
Fans.
There were probably less than 200 UTSA fans in attendance, but there were that many Coastal Carolina fans there either, to be fair. I mean, overall, the bowl attendance was announced at 8,100, and I would be surprised if there were really that many people in the stands.
Yeah, but I think the Coastal side, on their visitor side, so to speak, was a little more packed, and I think probably played off much better on camera than the UTSA side, where you had this just small area around midfield where everybody was kind of
Yeah, concentrated.
Yeah, concentrated. So, I mean, I think overall it was a good experience. Even though you had it being the third coldest game in UTSA history, which, by the way, it looks like the UTSA is beginning to be successful in cold environments.
Right.
I think I was glad to have that indoor space because I wasn't sure if there was going to be rain or any other elements that your boy can't handle.
Yeah, I mean, the fans that sat on the UTSA side were in the sun, and they said it was fine, after kickoff and the sun came out and it warmed up a little bit. And we walked over there at the very end, but it certainly was nice to have a spot where when it got a little cool, you could go inside and warm up a bit. And it was sort of interesting. They had, because you mentioned they didn't have any suites, they just sort of curtained off a section of the area for Dr. Campos because it's, traditional when you have an athletic director coming to your school, they generally give a suite to that
Right.
athletic director. But again, when you don't have a suite, there's not one to give. So they just kind of like curtained off a section for Dr. Campos and Coach Traylor's family. But like I said, it was great though just to have that warm space to go to because it was fairly cold, at least when you were in the shade.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get to the beginning of the game here because we finally got to see, I think, a game where UTSA finally put it together on the road.
Yeah, I mean it was that road game that we were all expecting from this team, and we just didn't see it, earlier in the season.
Right. And we started off a little rocky in the first quarter, but I think one thing we really didn't mention in our preview was that we anticipated there being some rust because it had been like 3 weeks since UTSA had last played, and if you start thinking about it, like these guys are used to maybe a week off at most,
Right.
off a bye week. So not having that rhythm, not having kind of that consistent schedule that they're used to. I have a problem with how much time there is between the last games and bowl season, right? Like to me, it should start off pretty quickly after the end of the season. Why? Because you get to see, I would say, better football. Otherwise, you kind of got teams just hanging around for a while. And I get that there's finals, but I think you can kind of work around that.
Well,
But-
and now, especially with the transfer portal being open during that time period, it's just makes it harder because every day at the end of practice, these coaches are probably finding out that somebody else is changing their mind and jumping in the portal. And,
Right,
so you just have this
right.
fluctuation. It's not like that time really helps as much as you would think it would.
For me, I think we looked at this Coastal team early on, and it was going to be tough because we didn't know who was going to play. We knew that there was going to be sort of a rocky way about them because of the uncertainty of, again, like I said, the players. But for them to start off with a delay of game penalty because they decided to receive the football on the kickoff and they start off with a delay of game, that's not a buttoned up team, right?
No,
Like that's
certainly
just not the way that I would say Tim Beck wanted to start out. But how do you go into a game and just you don't know what the first offensive play you're going to run? Like it should be just, all right, guys, all right, cool, let's line up, let's go. This is unless you last second decided to change something.
Right.
So I scratch my head at that. But I mean, again, I think Tim Beck needs to kind of be looked at because of the fact that you talked about all these guys coming in the portal before the game. And then you have these players go in after the game,
Right.
including Braden Bennett, their star running back, I guess, so to speak. I just look. We discussed it in our preview that Tim Beck didn't seem long for this job, and I think this game illustrated it. You go back to him stating that you don't build programs anymore. You just kind of build teams season to season, and they brought it up during the broadcast.
Right.
But all he has to do is look across the field to his old buddy, Jeff Traylor, and see how to build a program. Like, I get where Tim Beck is coming from, but I have to disagree heartily here that as much as we've criticized Coach Traylor, this season over some of the things that maybe he hasn't been able to do or has questioned about his whole culture, it works, and it's got players staying. And for UTSA, yes, there are players leaving for the portal, but a lot of these are guys that we knew were probably going to leave. They were seeking more playing time, which they knew they were going to get. And there's some other things that we'll probably talk about here, at the end of this podcast episode. But for really, I think for Beck, I mean, it just feels like the Coastal players aren't sold on him. The fans certainly have soured on him.
Yeah, I mean, it was very clear throughout the game that the fans were very frustrated with him. And then, certainly at the end of the game, as you're walking out, you kind of hear the comments. The Coastal fans were all very nice and pleasant to everybody
absolutely.
from UTSA. Probably a little bit annoyed that we were interspersed on their side of the field just because of that, club area that they had sold to the UTSA fans as well. So, there were times when we were kind of cheering where you'd have fans looking back like, what, you're on the wrong side of the stadium. You shouldn't be over there.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they were all, really nice. And you could just tell, though, that they were checked out on the coach and, kind of checked out on the season for the most part. So, like you said, it wouldn't be a surprise to hear at the end of next year that they parted ways with Tim Beck, or maybe even in the middle of the season, just depending on how things go. I mean, he's got to rebuild an entire roster now. He's got to get a new coordinator. He's had another defensive coach leave. I mean,
it's just, yeah. I mean, if it was because of success, then no, we totally feel you, Tim Beck, but it's not because of success. I mean, he came in and started out his press conference when he would join Coastal and said, "I'm not going to screw this up." And there are several fans that are now saying, you're screwing this up.
Right. I mean, on the UTSA side, really the only surprises going into the bowl game were just finding out earlier in the week that Jamori had opted out. And we knew that there might be an opt-out or there would be some kind of surprise that would come up. Coach Traylor's pretty good at keeping those things under wraps. So we were anticipating something popping up, just didn't know exactly what it was going to be.
Right.
The other one was just the quarterback situation. Obviously we knew that Owen was going to be the starter. We knew from Traylor's comments that it was likely that Eddie Lee would be there as a backup.
Uh-huh.
But we were fully expecting to see Brandon Tennyson as QB number 3. And then we find out that day, Brandon Tennyson wasn't available. Now, JJ Perez reported there were some players that had the flu, sort of alluded to the fact that maybe that was the situation with Brandon Tennyson, but I don't believe there was anything official discussed about him.
Right.
So to see Jackson Gilkey suiting up as, QB3, I think was a surprise. And then we see Demetrius Davis warming up as a running back, not as a quarterback. So, not really sure what's going on with Demetrius. Is he converting to a running back? Was that just for depth? He did come in and play a couple of snaps at the very end of the game. So I guess that's just something we need to kind of keep an eye on for 2025.
Yeah. Certainly things that we're probably going to keep on in the off season too, going into spring training. I mean, it's head scratchers when we got there, but all turned out well, right? So again, 10 penalties again for this UTSA squad. Lots of unsportsmanlike penalties. I'd mentioned to you that I thought that there was no reason for the chippiness from the UTSA side. You get Coastal wanting to prove themselves. They've been on the bench. They're finally getting their chance for some ton of snaps, and they're going to defend their home field.
Yeah, it was just kind of interesting to hear the announcers when we watched the replay after the game, kind of questioning why was there so much chippiness in this game? These teams haven't played each other before. There's not a history here. But certainly it just seems like UTSA, that's kind of our style of play at times.
Well, and Jeff Traylor alludes to that and says, we're going to, kind of toe that line. And look, I totally understand, but now it all makes sense because he also says that he's going to defend, his players no matter what. So now, it makes sense that this team can be so undisciplined at times.
Right.
It makes sense that, Coach Traylor, while he himself is emotional, his team is going to play emotionally. And at times, that emotion is going to carry over, and it's going to cost this team at times. We saw it plenty of times this season where that certainly happened.
Right.
But, I think it's something we're going to have to discuss when we get to looking back at this season. One thing I do want to talk about, though, was I had noticed near the end of the game, I noticed that there was a little dog at the feet of Kamar Missouri on the sideline, and I took a video, and we were both just baffled, like, what's going on? And then find out his name is Fredo, and then he is celebrated along with the team when they get the bowl trophy. And so it was really cool. But Atos is it going to be the new? Is Fredo going to be the new mascot here?
Man, if I were Rowdy, I might be a little worried because the team is really rallying around Fredo, more so than I've ever seen them rally around Rowdy himself. Just saying.
I mean, Fredo's adorable, man. So
Yeah.
it was good to see that Kamar even announced that he's going to be back for another season. So we get Fredo back for another season.
Yeah.
I can't wait to be around Fredo for one more season. It's one of those UTSA things, and I tweeted it out. It's the best UTSA thing ever. But look, there's some things that we obviously have to talk about. At some point, it's just I don't think everything was fixed. It was an overall good win for UTSA. Obviously they get their first road win. However, I'm not going to say but, however, there was certainly some opportunities for improvement. But let's start out with special teams because Tate Sandell was certainly not an area of concern.
Yeah, I mean, just nice, consistent kicking from Tate again. He came in to the field goal kicking, role sort of in the early part of the season. And ever since he's taken over that responsibility, we've just really seen very consistent kicking from him. And, he's kind of turning out to be that clutch field goal kicker in, the style of Jared Sackett and Hunter Duplessis, that
Right.
we've started to see from UTSA.
He's got a great leg. And like I said, earlier in some of the game reviews, is that you hear him kicking the dome and there's just a boom when he kicks it. But I want to point this one out because I really loved how he did this. And I don't know if he did it on purpose, but after Owen scored his rushing touchdown to put UTSA up 14-0 in the second quarter, Tate sends a kickoff that just kind of died. And I thought was going to roll out of bounds. And I think it kind of fooled Coastal a little too, but they allowed it to bounce and it kind of dies at the 2-yard line. And now it's badly played by the Coastal returner because all of a sudden he's got to try to find a way to A, get control of the ball, and then B, try to get a return out of it with UTSA flying down the field.
Yeah, and I think there was some confusion just from the people who are watching the game around us because they were thinking once that ball hit the ground that it would roll out of bounds and it would be like, moved to a touchback but because it hit the ground, it was actually a live ball. So
Correct.
If the Coastal player didn't pick it up, UTSA could have picked it up, right?
Right. We could have recovered and we could have been right there, right by the end zone, just put another touchdown, getting a chance for another touchdown. But that was one of I think, just a key play from Tate. And again, I'm not sure if he planned it that way, but I mean, I'm going to give him the credit because we've seen some really good kicking from him all season. Let's talk real quick about Chris Carpenter, though, as our returner.
Yeah, I mean, it was really great to see Chris Carpenter add his third kickoff return to his resume. Before Chris Carpenter became a returner, no one in UTSA history had ever scored a touchdown on a kickoff return. He's leaving UTSA now with 3 kickoff returns. This one matching, one of his longest. It was just a great moment because prior to that, we had seen a not great moment from Chris Carpenter.
Yeah. So I'll counter with the bad of Chris Carpenter, which was him swinging at a Coastal player during a punt return. This is where I struggle with him, Toes, is that he's talented, and I really like some of the things he does. But this is the frustrating part about Chris Carpenter is that he doesn't need to be around the punt return. You see a lot of teams and a lot of top teams in the playoffs that stay away from the punt. Like the punt hits the ground, they just run away from it. They do not want to get hit with that ball.
Right, because you don't want it to turn into a live ball.
Right. Chris always goes and gets in the middle of those scrums, and I don't understand why. And that's the undisciplined part of that we had been talking about. It's not just with flags, but even after that, it felt like Traylor was standing up for Chris with the refs.
Yeah, I mean, he was trying to say, they were trying to push Chris towards the ball because that's exactly what Coastal was trying to do. They're like, he's right here in the middle of it. If this ball touches him, it's live, and then we can, pick it up and score.
Yeah, they've got a chance to at least get the ball back, right? But that's the bad part about Chris Carpenter, right? Because you don't need to be around that ball whatsoever. Just go away, get back to the sideline, and let's go. Let's regroup. Nothing good can come of it, yet Chris just sticks around. And that's That has to be not only just Traylor, but Zach Brown as your, special teams coordinator, right? How many times did I have to tell him, get away from that ball?
Yeah.
And that's the tough part and why I just cringe every single time I saw a Chris Carpenter punt return, because those are the types of plays, and he's done it all season, where he toes the line. And like, I'm okay towing the line at times, but there are some things you just got to just throw it to the side and let's just get moving.
Yeah, I think just those two plays were kind of they sum up Chris Carpenter, like, in his season, his career at UTSA in a nutshell, right? Like, you see these fabulous moments from Chris and you're so excited for him, and it's like he got it all together. It's great. And then you see this next moment, you're like, "Oh, Chris, why?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
it is. And I think that's really why I get so frustrated with him, is the fact that you got that kickoff return. Just, man, let that be your moment. Let that be that you put it together and got all this, because he did a great job on offense all season, and then all of a sudden, here he is swinging at this player, and it's like, all right, great. Again, the chippiness we had talked about.
right.
What are we doing here? All right. Well, we kind of mentioned some of the things he did on offense. Let's get to talking about the offense. My key to victory was take advantage of the ground game, and take advantage we did. Tovs, 31 rushes for 257 yards. That is 8.3 average yards per carry, 3 touchdowns. Just an overall balanced game from UTSA offensively. I just mentioned the 257 rushing. We also had 256 passing. I mean, this Coastal defense wore down, and we had talked about plenty during the preview about the fact that we didn't know who was going to play on either side of the ball for Coastal. And I think Coastal did as well as they could. But I also mentioned in the preview that this was a statistically bad defense. So even if their portal guys and their top players like Clev Lubin and Matthew McDoom had been playing, I still don't think this was going to go Coastal's way, because, there were things like they were allowing 405 yards per game. They allowed UTSA to gain 513 in this game. They allowed 30 points per game at home. They allowed 44 points from UTSA. The third down conversions, the red zone. It's just, as I said when I first started this, that first delay of game from Coastal, I know it wasn't on defense, but it just seemed like it set up the whole day for the Coastal team. And this UTSA offense would seem to be chomping at the bit to really kind of get going and really punish this Coastal defense.
Yeah, I will say, though, that first quarter when we didn't score immediately after, I did almost think, is it going to be just like every other road win or every other road game where we find a way to just keep the other team in the game and make mistakes? Yeah. And then, once we got to the second quarter, though, it was clear that UTSA had, gotten all the rust out of their system. They'd woke up. I don't know, maybe the coffee started flowing through them, or caffeine or whatever. And then it was like, once they turned it on, man, there was no turning back.
Well, I wish I would seen if it was Fredo. Maybe Fredo had something to do with that, right?
Maybe.
But, honestly, it did. You're right. I think some of that rust from the 3-week layoff, but I think also it's just, I don't think they came out with a great game plan. I don't know if they were just kind of looking at the fact that they had seen the weather reports that we had, which was, kind of 10-mile-per-hour wind. How does that affect kicking game? And, Coach Traylor had talked about it up to the bowl game, was, hey, that it's going to be a wind going, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to kick field goals. I'm not really sure we're going to be able to do this and that. So it felt like they tailored and scripted something for the elements, but the elements never were quite there, because even when we were there, you could feel a wind.
But it was not.
But it wasn't as strong. Windy. Right. It wasn't as strong as we thought it was going to be. And I think we both looked at each other, obviously going, this is not going to be as bad in terms, But like you said earlier, if you were in, say, the shade, it was cold. But there's a difference between just being cold and being cold and really windy.
Right.
Let's talk real quick about Will Henderson. 51-yard touchdown, put him at the top of running back stats here for the game.
Yeah, that really is the reason why he was at the top of the stats, because he really only had 5 carries. But, it was great to see him break out and get his first collegiate touchdown. I think you feel comfortable knowing next year, if we have him and Brandon High together as running backs, and then you throw in Bryson Donnell, I think we'll be in a really good place.
Yeah, and I think that, having him just as that kind of like we had, three-headed monster, it helps distribute carries. Now, one
Right.
of the thing is I think we have to watch out for, and potentially we'll probably talk about, when we look back on the season, is should we be, spreading out carries so much? Like, is
Hmm.
that something that the coaching staff may need to fix? But yeah, I think Will Henderson does a good job here. You obviously have David Amador have another good game in terms of receiving. He's got 7 catches for 110 yards. You see Devin McEwen come back. I know you had a concern early on when it seemed like he had re-injured himself early
Yeah,
in the
that
game.
first carry of the game, it looked like he hurt his shoulder, and you see him go off with the trainers. And I thought, okay, this again, that was at the point where we hadn't scored yet. You just sort of felt like what's going to happen. And then to see him come back and play really well the rest of the game was nice. I got a little frustrated that we got bogged down in the third quarter, had to settle for field goals. But, again, there were a couple of moments where we've just had this wonderful second quarter. We seem unstoppable. And then we kind of bogged down a little bit in the third. But, ultimately, having Owen as our quarterback, his leadership, you know, there's a reason he was the MVP for this bowl. He really, I thought, had a great game. I mean, yes, he made a mistake during the game, but that's going to happen anytime you have a human out playing a game. They're going to make a mistake.
Right.
But, I just thought that he seemed very comfortable. He seemed in command. And hey, now we're 2-0 with Owen as a starter as our quarterback in bowl games. So,
Yeah,
one,
put him in the record books, right? Like you were
yep.
talking about Chris earlier, Chris Carpenter. So, I'm with you. I think he was unflinching in some of the adversity that he could have faced during this game, but it just felt like, again, it's odd to me that you have a quarterback like Frank Harris hand off to Owen, because it still feels like there's similar types of players. Yes, there's plenty of differences, but there are similar types of leadership. And
Mm-hmm.
even though, they're kind of at the polar ends, it's still this unflinching leadership that says we're going to get things done. And, I think that's going to be something good to talk about as we go through in the off season. Let's get to the defense. This one was going to be a wild card, but, our key to victory was force Tad Hudson to beat you through the air. He was 17 for 26 for 173 yards, 2 touchdowns. Yeah, obviously kind of decent numbers and probably the types of numbers that we thought maybe we'd see from him. But if they weren't any better, I think that was going to put off, especially kind of sound a lot of alarms for UTSA fans,
Right.
because that would have meant that, he was having a good enough game to put Coastal in position to win this game. But, these touchdowns really came in the fourth quarter after the game was really kind of decided.
Right.
I will say this about Tad Hudson. And watching him play, I said, I'm not really sure. I think he's an okay quarterback. I still think he's fine. I think, he's a little better than I thought he was. But he's a good building block, I think, for this Coastal team
Yeah.
and Tim Beck to kind of shape an offense around him. Because I think it's clear by the way that I saw him play that kind of option offense that they've been using, that doesn't fit Tad. Tad seems more of like a quick passing game,
Mm-hmm.
kind of mixed in with maybe some play action, because he seemed to kind of really do well in the play action. He did take off a couple times running.
Right. Which I think, surprised us at first. And again, probably contributed to some of the struggles in that first quarter a little bit
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I don't know that they were expecting that from him.
No. And it's not like he was, incredibly athletic. And so, he really tore off these long gains.
Right.
But they were enough to kind of keep UTSA from being as aggressive. But Jess Lepp sent some different looks at him, did put a spy on him a couple times. And, I thought that it seemed to hamper poor Tad. And I say poor Tad because your very first start, like you're going up against a seasoned defensive coordinator with a defense that has very few opt-outs. So they're coming straight at you. And this is a very good UTSA defense we talked about statistically on third and fourth down. So if you can't win those downs, and Coastal didn't, you're going to have problems winning a game. And you talked about earlier, hey, we knew that this Coastal offense was going to be in disarray.
Right.
And it's kind of like what we saw, though, right?
Yeah. I mean, they tried everything, though. They pulled out a couple of trick plays. They were almost successful at executing them, just, had a couple of mistakes. But, certainly they were at a disadvantage, and you could tell, that there just wasn't enough time and enough chemistry with the guys that had been on the field for them to really make an impact.
Yeah, and that would be the only argument I think Coastal would be, yeah, we wanted maybe an extra week or so to practice so that we could
Yeah.
maybe put in some other things to kind of get Tad a little more comfortable. But again, they throw the first swing with like this essentially double pass that they call, as you mentioned, the gadget plays, and they executed everything terrifically up until the point that the wide receiver drops the ball.
Yeah, I think it actually was the running back who they threw to, and he just didn't turn, at the right time. He didn't time it well, and, he dropped it. But, man, if he would have timed that better, that could have been a touchdown.
It was an easy touchdown. We got burned on that. That was, like I said, it was a well drawn up play and a well timed gadget play. Like that was something that I'm like, hey Jeff and Burke, you guys both need to kind of be taking some notes here, because that's how you time. That's how you when you time out a gadget play, and that one seemed to work, right? Like so, again, they don't complete it, but I think this Coastal offense always kind of struggled all year, and they only put up 271 total yards, 173 through the air, as I mentioned before, but only 98 rushing. And of course, you're not going to rush too much on this UTSA defense that gears up to stop the run. So
yeah, I mean, once they figured out that Hudson was going to potentially take off, and like you said, they put a spy on him, you saw the rushing game really struggle, because they were ready and expecting Brayton Bennett, to try to, kind of consistently gash them. You could tell they weren't anticipating Hudson.
Yeah, and Brayton Bennett really couldn't get going. That was really the other part to it, was this as much as they needed that running game, they just could not find ways to get a consistent rush going, and that was just getting them off the field, consistently. And of course, you hear Coastal fans start saying, "Well, that's a bad play call." But honestly, what did you expect? Like,
right.
Again, with so many opt-outs and so many guys out, and you haven't had a really good offense all season, I don't know that you could have expected this against this UTSA defense that, its whole is the pass defense, and there was no way that I thought that Tad Hudson was really going to put together a good enough game to beat this UTSA defense. Look, Atos, we do continue our streak of sacks and giveaways, though.
Yeah, certainly if you wanted to nitpick anything, I mean, I guess you could say, perhaps Jacavian should have knocked that ball down instead of intercepting it. But at the time it happened, we were so far ahead in that game, it didn't really matter in the big scheme of things. And, Jacavian's young, and it was his first interception, so he was probably more excited about getting an interception than thinking about, kind of that bigger strategy of where he was now, going to be getting the ball for UTSA and kind of changing our field position.
And look, to be fair, Jacavian ran that route to perfection.
Yeah.
I mean, he ran it better than the wide receiver. So I'm fine with him intercepting it. I mean, it was a great play. Other than that, I mean, I think you start looking at it and you see this defense do exactly what it's done to some bad offenses. They came out and they won the line of scrimmage, and I guess you could nitpick about the 173 yards through the air. I mean, it's 173 yards through the air. Like something's got to give. And,
right.
50 of those yards came on a touchdown pass, early in the fourth quarter. But, you start kind of looking at some of these numbers and you're like, UTSA defense stood up when it needed to.
Right.
And it gave our UTSA offense an opportunity. So, and the UTSA offense kind of did its thing. So I think it's safe to say, Atovs, that all three facets of the game for UTSA played really well, and hence why you get a 44-15 victory.
Absolutely. Before we go, let's talk about some changes that came out recently with JUCO eligibility, and some just roster changes that we've found out about since the bowl game. After Diego Pavia sued the NCAA to get his additional JUCO eligibility, there was initially this ruling that came out and said this there was an injunction, but it was specific to Diego Pavia himself and didn't apply to anyone else. And then shortly thereafter, I think right after the bowl game, actually, they came out and said that the injunction would apply to anybody who was a senior and was about to use their last year or had used their last year of eligibility. If they had been at JUCO, they would get one more year back. So certainly that changed a lot of things for these kids that had thought they were declaring for the NFL or didn't have any more eligibility left to play. So it sounds like a few Roadrunners are going to take advantage of that and come back for one more season. You know, the unfortunate piece with this in terms of timing is that you've already got the transfer portal open at this point. You've already had early signing day. And so in some of these cases, you may have a player that announces that he's going to come back and you may not have a roster spot available for them.
Right.
So we know that CJ James has announced that he will be entering the transfer portal and using his last year. It was also reported that Jamori Robinson is in the portal now, potentially using his last year, although he's probably still weighing his option of whether or not he's going to go into the draft or if he's going to stay and transfer somewhere else.
Right.
And then Martavius French has said that he'll be coming back, although we don't necessarily know that he's going to come back to UTSA. Haven't heard that he's in the transfer portal yet, but we'll just kind of have to wait and see. And then we heard that Cyrus Dumas is also weighing his options. It doesn't sound like he's made a decision. He sort of put out this tweet saying, you know, one more year ? So sounds like he's thinking about it, but you know, we haven't heard anything definitive from him either. So
yeah, I think that, you know, Cyrus coming back potentially and Martavius, those would be huge wins for the UTSA defense for next year because
right.
you're bringing back veterans.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great, certainly, for both of them to come back. You know, if you look at it in terms of single digits that will be returning next season, right now, Owen Pee-wee is the only one who's going to be coming back. So to also have Martavius French, I think, would be a nice add.
Right.
It's going to be a very different defense, you know, next season. My guess is with CJ James, the reason he's probably entering the transfer portal is because we didn't have a spot for him. You know, they've already added, I think, 3 offensive linemen through the transfer portal. And, you know, if that's the case, you know, it's unfortunate that the timing just didn't work out. But you just never know when you hear these kids hitting the transfer portal. They always have, you know, different reasons for what they're looking for. Outside of the JUCO ruling, we also heard Denver Harris announce that he'll be entering the transfer portal. I don't think that was particularly surprising. You know, he's had some success at UTSA. Certainly, you know, had he come back, that would have been a good thing, but not surprised to see him, you know, want to move on. So he'll probably try to get back into a P4 program would be my guess.
Possibly. I mean, I think the other part to it is that he's still got to rebuild, you know, some of the off the field things that he had,
right.
You know, kind of messed up at the P4 level. I don't know that his season that he had this past season with UTSA necessarily has P4s just lining up down,
sure.
You know, knocking on his door, I guess is the best way to put it. But you never know. That could happen to your point. But I wish him well, right? Like, appreciate you and the season you gave here at UTSA because it probably would have gotten dicier without him. So
yeah, absolutely. And then congratulations to Patrick Overmeyer. He was named to the Athletics All-American Freshman Team.
Yeah, nice job from Patrick. I mean, obviously, you know, you want to keep him under wraps because, you know, other teams are going to want to pilfer him. But, you know, to me, UTSA like recruits 5 tight ends every year anyway, and we convert them anyway. So, I mean, it's not like we couldn't have some tight end come in, and I think we've recruited at least 2 this season. So
yeah, hopefully, though, you know, we'll maintain him at least for another year or so.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the women's basketball team. You know, obviously the apple of our eye. Today, they end up beating Charlotte 64-50, which got them to 10-2 and 1-0 in conference. You know, before then, they had taken on Texas State right before the Christmas holiday, and they took care of Texas State, and that's all that matters. Finally got the win over Texas State that I think Karen Asset had been looking for, and
Right.
it was dominant, enough to just, I think it, at the very least, maybe a little bit, just kind of makes up for the big loss in San Marcos by the football team. But Sydney Love ends up the AAC Player of the Week, honorable mention. She's been just absolutely scorching hot.
Yeah.
I mean, had some like essentially step back threes that she's had that move before, but this season, and I think some of it has to do with the fact that Nina is there. She's just been able to easily go into that move and just easily get off her 3-point shot. So it's really been great to see this UTSA team and how they've constructed this team. One of the things that I heard today from one of the Charlotte analysts was it is well built, is really what she said, and she's like it's built in a certain way where it is very flexible, and you see Karen Aston just not afraid to put out freshmen or just put out any player out there, and that makes this team even much more dangerous.
Yeah, I think the thing I've noticed that's been different this season is, they've always talked about trying to be a defensive team, and you would see them really press it last year, kind of in the third quarter, fourth quarter, and sometimes at that point when they started pressing, they might have gone through some droughts. They're maybe behind in the game. This season, you see them pressing in the first quarter. It's like they come out immediately with this very tough defense and they start pressing right away. And it really seems to throw off these teams. That's what happened in Texas State. We saw it today in Charlotte. And then they're able to build a lead in the first quarter, which helps them when they do go through these scoring droughts that we've talked about before, because they continue to have them from time to time.
Yeah.
But because they've built this cushion, they're in a better position to kind of get through that. And then if they have sloppy play or they get into foul trouble, again, it's like that security cushion that they've created so that they can then get it back together and ultimately win the game by a large margin.
Well, as I said earlier, they are 10-2, and that is the best start in UTSA history since 1985-86 season. That is right, since the 80s. So, holy cow, what a season our UTSA women are having up to this point. Next up, New Year's Day against UAB, one of the top teams in the AAC. They'll be coming to the Convo, 6:30 p.m. Then they head back on the road to face Tulsa next Saturday at 2 p.m. on ESPN Plus. Atovs, I think this UAB team is going to be a nice barometer for how conference is going to go. UAB's put together a pretty good squad, and they've always kind of given us a tough time. So we'll see how that goes. Tulsa, I think, is a much more manageable team, but that doesn't mean that it's certainly a given that they're going to win. So let's get to the men's basketball team. They wrapped up their non-conference schedule today against Army with a loss, 78-75. They were behind Army for most of the game. It just seemed like they just couldn't get their offense really rolling. Mm-hmm. And I will say, though, they were able to make a small comeback near the end, and really put some pressure on Army. But unfortunately, Smurf Millender got off his 3-point shot at the end, and it was just off the rim. So while there is, I think, some good things happening with the men's basketball team, I think consistency is going to be the big thing that Coach Clonch is going to be looking for as they head into conference play, because much like the women, they go through these wild points where they're kind of throwing the ball away. I know that chemistry has a little bit to do with it, but I think the other part too, this is the fact that, once they get a little wild, I think Coach Clonch is trying to figure out how to rein them back in and kind of get them, in a better spot. Whereas like the women, they do get a little bit wild, but they correct themselves. And that comes from the maturity and the fact that a lot of these players have been playing together for 2-3 years now.
Right.
So, obviously, again, it comes down a little bit to chemistry, but I think the men's team, while they have have got a little bit more growth over the last few games, I still think that, they're going to be tough to beat in conference. I still don't think that it's going to be they're going to be number 2 in the AAC, but I think they're going to be a tough play for any team, either on the road or in the Convo.
Yeah, and their next game is their conference opener on Saturday, 5 p.m. against Tulane in New Orleans. That game will also be on ESPN+.
Cool. Hey, real quick before we close, do want to say that we were able to meet a whole bunch of people on the, in the Dirty Murdy, I guess you can say, or Myrtle Beach.
Hey, and the Dirty Murdy, that's what they called it, not us. Okay?
Yeah. So I've been saying it the whole time. That wasn't me. That's what they call it. So yeah, glad to have met them. Some of them, we mentioned that we do this podcast. Actually, one of our neighbors, from a couple blocks away, just happened to be walking his dog, and I told him, hey, we do a podcast. He said, you're a UTSA fan, so it's really cool, kind of being able to talk with a whole bunch of these different UTSA fans, and so I appreciate anybody listening. This is our last episode before the new year, so hopefully this next year I think we've got some cool things going on with some of the sports, and hopefully we continue doing the basketball stuff.
Yeah, for our 100th episode, we will have our special guest joining us, Big Brown, our friend, who will be helping us to recap not only the season, but also to take a retrospect back at the first 5 years of the trailer era.
Should be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on the Hail Married podcast. I'm Atos.
And I'm the Toves.
Like we mentioned, we'll be back for that 100th episode in a few weeks.
Birds up.